David Rosenfeld was a man of reason. Born into a prominent Jewish family in Brooklyn, he was both a respected legal mind and a devout cultural Jew. Though he attended synagogue during high holidays and honored tradition, David didn't truly believe in God. His real faith was in logic, law, and the power of the mind. A Harvard Law graduate, he had built a name defending high-profile clients and unraveling complex legal cases. He wasn't unkind, just skeptical. He often joked, "God's a metaphor, not a man in the sky." For him, heaven and hell were concepts to keep people morally in check, nothing more. His wife, Rachel, a warm-hearted woman of modest faith, would sometimes ask him to pray with her. He'd smile, give her hand a squeeze, and decline. "If God wants me, He knows where to find me," he'd say. Then came the heart attack. It was sudden. One moment he was at his desk preparing closing arguments, the next he was on the floor, gasping for air. Paramedics arrived quickly, but by the time he reached the hospital, he was clinically dead for 6 minutes. David Rosenfeld, staunch atheist, cultural Jew, master of courtroom logic, was about to face a reality no earthly argument could explain. The courtroom of belief. For most of his life, David Stein had defended people in courtrooms packed with skeptics, judges, and juries. But deep down, he didn't realize he was also putting God on trial in his own heart. After all, he was a man of reason, a Harvard-educated lawyer, a Jewish intellectual, raised in a Reform Jewish home, and later, a proud secular agnostic. God, to him, was a cultural concept, not a person. Religion was useful, even poetic, but outdated. Truth came from logic. Morality was best understood through philosophy. But deep down, something gnawed at him. David had built a fortress of success, a Manhattan apartment, a 6-figure salary, a loving wife, 2 grown children, but still, his soul felt bankrupt. He had no language for that emptiness. He wouldn't even admit it. Not until the day everything collapsed. It started with the chest pain, sharp, sudden, unforgiving. He was in court, mid-sentence, when it struck. He clutched his chest, staggered, then collapsed in front of the judge, jury, and his shocked colleagues. His last memory was of someone shouting, "He's not breathing." Then, blackness. But the black didn't last. He woke up, not in a hospital. Not in a room. Not even in a space he could define. It was like floating, but not floating. He wasn't in his body anymore, yet somehow, he was more himself than ever. No heartbeat, no breath, yet he was alive. Fully conscious. Aware. David was suspended in a realm of darkness, but it wasn't empty. There was weight to it, a suffocating presence. A sense of judgment, like every hidden thing in him was being exposed. He saw flashes, images from his life. Moments he was proud of, then others he wasn't. Lies he told. People he hurt. Decisions he justified under the banner of strategy and law. He tried to argue, to explain. But there was no one to argue with. Then a voice, not external, but within him, asked, "Who did you serve?" The question stopped him cold. He wanted to say, "My family," or "my clients." But none of those answers satisfied. Something deeper was being demanded. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that all his life, he had served himself. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, colder. Panic set in. "Where am I?" he whispered. Then, light. Blinding, brilliant light. Warmth unlike anything on earth. And from within that light, a figure stepped forward. Clothed in radiant white. David couldn't see his face clearly, but his presence radiated power and love. And then, the figure spoke. "David, why do you resist the truth?" David shook. He knew that voice. Not from experience, but from somewhere deep in his soul. A memory he never knew he had. A recognition so profound it brought him to his knees. The name pressed against his lips before he even realized it. Jesus. And at that moment, everything changed. The name that shattered everything. David could barely whisper the name. Jesus. But the moment he did, it was as if the very fabric of his being cracked open. That single name, the one he had spent decades avoiding, mocking, and intellectualizing away, now rang like a divine bell across the dimension he was in. There was no echo, only clarity. No debate, only truth. And suddenly, the light grew even stronger. It was not blinding anymore. It was comforting. Healing. And that figure, Jesus, stepped closer. David still couldn't see his full face, but he could feel his eyes. They didn't judge like a courtroom. They didn't accuse like his own conscience. They knew him, and loved him anyway. David wept. He couldn't hold himself together. Every wall he had spent a lifetime building, skepticism, logic, doubt, pride, collapsed in an instant. He was utterly undone. And Jesus simply stood there, letting him fall apart in his presence. Then, Jesus reached out his hand. David felt something that words could never express, a love that burned and healed at the same time. It was not just emotional, it was surgical. This love went into the deep roots of his soul, into the buried pain, the childhood questions, the wounds he'd ignored, the pride he had clung to, and gently tore them out, like a surgeon removing tumors. "I didn't know. I didn't know," David sobbed. "You did," Jesus replied softly. "I was calling you your whole life." And then, like waves, memories returned, moments David had brushed off but now saw differently. The Christian friend in college who gently asked him if he'd ever read the Gospels. The Christmas Eve church service he once visited out of curiosity, where a carol had moved him to tears. The courtroom janitor who always wore a cross and told him she prayed for him. Jesus had been there, knocking. Whispering. Loving. The words of Jesus cut and healed him in the same breath. He wept reading about the cross. He trembled reading about the resurrection. It wasn't just theology now. It was testimony. His own. One afternoon, he returned to the mirror. This time, he smiled. Because now, he saw more than a lawyer. More than a Jew. He saw a man redeemed. The rabbi's confrontation. David knew he couldn't keep silent forever, not just with his family or his legal colleagues, but especially with his community. He had grown up in a tight-knit Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn. His life revolved around the synagogue, and for years he'd studied under one of the most respected rabbis in the city, Rabbi Eliyahu Greenberg. If anyone needed to hear the truth, it was him. David arranged a meeting. He found the rabbi seated in his study, surrounded by ancient scrolls and volumes of Talmud. His long white beard and piercing eyes gave him the aura of a sage from another age. The familiar scent of old books and candles filled the room. "David," the rabbi greeted warmly. "It's been too long. I heard about your incident. Baruch Hashem, you're alive." David sat down slowly. "Thank you, Rabbi. But, something happened. Something I need to tell you." The rabbi tilted his head. "I'm listening." "I died, Rabbi. For a few minutes, I was gone. I left my body, and I met someone. Jesus." The rabbi's expression barely changed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. David continued, undeterred. "I saw him. He spoke to me. He told me he is the Messiah. The Son of God. And he told me to tell others. Silence. Then, the rabbi let out a deep sigh. David, you had a traumatic experience. The brain, under stress, can create visions. Hallucinations. We do not base truth on feelings. David leaned forward. But this wasn't a feeling. It was real. I saw him. I felt a love so overwhelming I can't even describe it. I've read the New Testament now. I've read Isaiah 53 again. And Rabbi, it's about him. Can't you see it? The rabbi's voice grew firm. David, we've known each other for many years. I respect your brilliance. But you are walking a dangerous path. To believe in Jesus as Messiah is to betray your people. No, David whispered. It's to fulfill what we've waited for. Rabbi, we've missed him for too long. The rabbi stood up, his face heavy with grief. You speak like a Christian. You are no longer one of us if you keep going down this road. David stood too, his heart breaking. I am more Jewish now than I've ever been. Because now I know the one the prophets spoke of. Yeshua HaMashiach. The rabbi looked at him one last time. Then may God have mercy on your soul. David left the study with tears in his eyes, but peace in his heart. He knew the cost. He knew the rejection. But he also knew the truth. He walked out into the street, raised his face toward the sun, and said aloud, I will not be silent. The mission had just begun. The cost of the cross. The days that followed were some of the hardest in David's life. Word had spread quickly through the community. Friends he had known since childhood stopped returning his calls. Invitations to family events mysteriously disappeared. And on Friday night, as he walked past his parents' home on the way back from work, he noticed the curtains close when he approached. He had become a stranger in his own people's eyes. The loneliness was sharp. But so was the clarity. Jesus had told his followers they would be rejected, just as he had been. And David was now beginning to understand the true cost of discipleship. The cross wasn't just a symbol on a chain. It was a dividing line. A death to old life. And he was feeling every cut of it. Yet, even in his grief, something else had begun to grow, compassion. He looked at his old community not with resentment, but with deep sorrow. They don't see him yet, he prayed. Just like I didn't. He began to fast. He studied the scriptures for hours. Not just the New Testament, but the Hebrew Bible through a new lens. Isaiah 53 no longer confused him, it made perfect sense. Psalm 22 described the crucifixion with eerie detail. Even Zechariah's prophecy, they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, took on a new weight. David was no longer just a lawyer. He was now a witness. And he had to speak. One night, he created a video on his old law firm's YouTube channel, something he'd once used for legal Q&A sessions. This time, he looked straight into the camera and told his story. He told the world that he had died. He told them about the light. The love. The man with scars. And he said his name boldly, Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah. I saw him. I met him. And I will never be the same. The video went viral. At first, there was backlash. Accusations. Harsh emails. Threats. But there were also messages from people who had seen Jesus in their dreams. Former Muslims. Atheists. Even other Jews who whispered that they too were having doubts. That they had questions but were too afraid to ask. David started a weekly Zoom group for seekers, those curious about Jesus but unsure how to begin. It was small at first, just 3 people. Then 7. Then 15. Each week they studied both the Torah and the Gospels. Slowly, eyes began to open. And David realized something powerful. His pain had become his platform. His rejection had created a refuge for others. The cross he bore had become a doorway, for many to walk through. He was no longer screaming in fear like he had when he returned from death. Now, he was proclaiming in victory. Jesus is real. He is alive. And he is the Messiah not just for Christians, but for everyone. A new fire within. David found that his days were no longer driven by court appearances and legal deadlines. Something deeper had ignited within him, an insatiable desire to share the truth that had once shattered his entire worldview. He wasn't just a man with a testimony, he was a man on a mission. It began with small gatherings in his home. A dozen curious souls, most of them Jewish, sat in a circle in his living room with open Bibles, sipping coffee and asking hard questions. Some were angry, others skeptical. But David welcomed them all. He knew what it was like to wrestle. He had spent his life resisting the very message he now clung to. Week after week, more people showed up. Word spread not because David advertised but because of the power of his story, and the conviction in his eyes when he spoke the name Jesus. One evening, a young Orthodox man named Eli showed up. He wore a yarmulke and tzitzit and sat silently for the first 3 meetings, arms crossed, listening. Then one night, he spoke. If what you're saying is true, David, then everything I've lived for has to be questioned. David nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And it's terrifying. But it's also the beginning of freedom. Eli's eyes welled with tears. He wasn't alone. Many in the room had experienced that moment, the realization that accepting Jesus meant giving up everything they once believed defined them. Their family, their traditions, even their place in the community. David didn't sugarcoat it. The gospel is offensive, he often said. Not because it's hateful, but because it forces us to admit we need saving. The more David taught, the clearer the message became: this wasn't about religion. It wasn't about abandoning Judaism. It was about recognizing its fulfillment. That Jesus didn't cancel the law, he completed it. That the prophets weren't just predicting a future kingdom but pointing to a coming king. And David had seen him. In one meeting, a former atheist stood up and asked, "Why you, David? Why would Jesus show himself to you of all people?" David smiled. Because he loves the lost. Because even a stubborn, prideful, educated man like me couldn't outrun his mercy. A fire had been lit in their midst. Not an emotionalism or a shallow hype, but a holy flame that burned deep, transforming hearts and renewing minds. People began getting baptized. Others started sharing their own testimonies. And through it all, David remained grounded. He prayed. He studied. And he never forgot the moment he had died, because that death had given him life. He was no longer a Jewish lawyer with a good reputation. He was a man who had met Jesus, and came back to tell the world. Confronting the backlash. As David's gatherings grew, so did the attention, both positive and negative. What started as quiet Bible study soon became the topic of whispered conversations in synagogues and heated debates in Jewish community centers. David wasn't surprised. He had once reacted the same way to those who had dared to leave Judaism for Jesus. Now, he was the one accused of betrayal. One morning, as he walked out of a local kosher market, an old friend from law school confronted him. "David, I don't know who you think you are," the man snapped. "But what you're doing? It's dangerous. You're misleading our people." David kept calm. "I understand how it feels. I felt the same way until you hallucinated during a near-death experience," the man interrupted. "You're embarrassing your heritage. Your father would be ashamed." That last line stung more than any insult. David stood there for a moment, quietly absorbing the weight of those words. His late father had been a pillar in their Jewish community. Would he have disowned him? Would he have tried to understand? That night, David couldn't sleep. He sat alone, thinking about the line he had crossed. There was no going back. But he wasn't alone in the fire. He remembered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, thrown into the flames, yet not burned. Jesus had been with them, even then. He opened his Bible to Matthew 10 verse 22, "You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." It was a sobering verse, but also a promise. Truth wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be proclaimed, no matter the cost. The next week, a group of protesters showed up outside his house with signs, "False Messiah. Traitor to Israel. Return to the truth." David didn't argue. He brought out coffee and water, offering it to them. Some scoffed. One man knocked the cup out of his hand. But David stood firm. Not in pride, but in love. That same evening, he gave a message titled, "Bless those who curse you." He shared his pain, his rejection, and his continued love for his people. "I am still Jewish," he said. "I haven't abandoned my identity, I've found its fulfillment in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah." A few protesters returned the next week, this time without signs. They sat in the back and listened. One of them, a young woman named Miriam, wept as David spoke about the crucifixion. She had never read Isaiah 53 before. Now it pierced her heart. Persecution didn't slow the movement, it refined it. And David knew this was only the beginning. For every door that closed, another was opening. For every insult, a soul was being stirred. He wasn't trying to start a rebellion. He was simply telling the truth about the name he had screamed the moment he returned from death. Jesus. Seeds among the stones. Despite the backlash, David remained steadfast. He knew that not everyone was ready to hear the truth, but some were. And it was for those few that he continued to speak, to share, and to testify. Each night, he prayed for wisdom and courage. And each morning, he woke up with renewed conviction that this path, though narrow and thorny, was the one he was called to walk. Then came a call that would shake him deeply. It was his older sister, Ruth. They hadn't spoken since the news of his conversion spread. Her voice was tight with emotion. "David, can we talk?" David's heart raced. "Of course. Come over. Anytime." That evening, Ruth arrived, her face drawn and eyes red from crying. She had tried to stay away, to avoid the confusion and pain of what he had done. But something had changed. "I had a dream last night," she said slowly. "It was about you, but it wasn't just you. There was this light. And a voice. It said your name, but also mine. It was like, it knew me. I woke up shaken. I can't explain it. But I had to come see you." David listened, his eyes welling with tears. "That voice," he said softly. "It was him. Jesus. He's calling you, Ruth." They talked for hours. David shared his full story, the courtroom in heaven, the brilliant light, the love that broke him, and the name that brought him back. Ruth was hesitant but curious. She had questions, so many questions. David didn't try to convert her. He simply answered, shared, and loved her through it. Weeks passed. Ruth began attending his gatherings in secret. She listened more than she spoke, her heart opening 1 inch at a time. One evening, during a quiet worship session, she quietly slipped to her knees and whispered the name that had changed her brother's life. Jesus. David wept as he held her. Another soul awakened. Another stone rolled away. Word spread slowly. Not everyone responded with joy. Some of their extended family cut ties entirely. But others reached out privately, curious, cautious, and searching. A cousin asked for a Bible. An uncle watched one of David's messages in secret. The seeds were taking root, even in unlikely places. David began writing, a memoir of his experience and the theological bridge between the Old Testament prophecies and the life of Jesus. He called it, Fulfilled, From Law to Messiah. It would be controversial, but it was honest. And it was born from personal resurrection. He knew that not everyone would understand. But he also knew the truth wasn't dependent on popular acceptance. Jesus hadn't come for the applause of men. He came to seek and save the lost. And now, David, the once proud lawyer, the staunch defender of the Torah, the man who met death face to face, was alive in the truest sense. He didn't just survive his near-death experience. He was reborn. From death to life, a mission begins. It had been nearly a year since David's near-death experience, but to him, it felt like a lifetime ago. In truth, it was another life, one ruled by pride, legalism, and a rigid identity that was built on intellect rather than intimacy with God. Now, everything was different. David stood behind a podium in a packed auditorium, a cross faintly lit in the background. The event was titled The Messiah and the Courtroom, One Lawyer's Journey into the Afterlife. Believers, skeptics, Jews, Christians, and the simply curious had gathered to hear his story. He took a breath, scanning the crowd. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here talking about Jesus, I would have laughed in your face and probably tried to debate you into silence, he began with a grin. But then, I died. The room grew still. I stood before the judge of all judges. Not a metaphorical courtroom. An eternal one.